Imagine walking into a government office and realizing that the law you thought protected you doesn't apply at all. Not because it's broken, but because the system itself quietly allows exceptions. Across the United States, countless laws carry hidden gaps, loopholes that few citizens ever notice. These gaps can influence everything from tax responsibilities to property rights, sometimes benefiting the very few while leaving most Americans unaware. Why does this happen? The answer lies in how laws are written. Every statute, from city ordinances to federal regulations, is designed with precision, but language can never account for every scenario. Ambiguity creeps in, and that ambiguity becomes a loophole. What seems like a simple rule on paper can unravel when applied to real-life situations. Lawyers, corporations, and even government agencies know this and often exploit these hidden spaces, while ordinary citizens remain largely in the dark. Take, for instance, the idea of exemptions in federal law. Most people assume that legal protection applies equally. Yet, subtle exceptions exist for specific industries, geographic areas, or even types of business activity. These exemptions are rarely publicized and are often buried in dense legislative text. Understanding them requires patience, attention to detail, and sometimes insider knowledge. What happens next is rarely discussed. Once a loophole is identified, it becomes a tool. Some are benign, like minor tax adjustments or procedural exceptions. Others can have profound consequences, quietly reshaping local economies or influencing social outcomes. Most Americans never notice these details, yet they affect day-to-day life in ways that are invisible. In this documentary, we will explore these hidden gaps in the American legal system. From tax codes to zoning regulations, from civil procedures to financial legislation, we will uncover how the law silently creates spaces that operate outside its apparent reach. The tax system is one of the most common areas where loopholes emerge. At first glance, the Internal Revenue Code seems rigid and absolute. Citizens file taxes annually, and the expectation is simple: pay what you owe. But beneath the surface, the code contains intricate provisions that allow for deductions, credits, and deferrals. What most Americans do not realize is that these provisions can drastically alter financial obligations depending on interpretation and timing. Corporations and wealthy individuals often have dedicated teams to navigate these subtleties. For example, some deductions are only accessible to certain business structures, while others rely on geographic classifications. A provision written for agricultural relief in the 1950s might still exist today, available to anyone able to meet specific technical requirements. Most people never notice this detail, but it can reduce tax liabilities significantly without technically breaking the law. Another layer of complexity comes from overlapping jurisdictions. Federal law sets the broad framework, but each state adds its own rules. The interaction between state and federal statutes can unintentionally create gaps, often exploited by professionals who understand how to structure financial arrangements legally. These strategies are rarely discussed openly, not because they are illegal, but because they operate in a gray zone that most citizens never encounter. The system quietly works like this. A law is written, exceptions are inserted, and interpretations multiply over time. Court rulings then define boundaries, sometimes expanding loopholes further. The result is a labyrinth of legal possibilities, accessible only to those who know where to look. The consequences are subtle yet profound. Ordinary Americans comply strictly with the law, often unaware that others operate under entirely different rules. This imbalance creates scenarios where the legal playing field is uneven, not by design but through. Property law in the United States provides another example of overlooked loopholes. Zoning regulations, inheritance rules, and property transfers appear straightforward, but hidden gaps can significantly alter outcomes. For instance, zoning codes are often drafted decades before neighborhoods evolve. Exceptions for commercial or mixed-use developments can remain unnoticed until someone leverages them to build beyond what seems legally permissible. Most Americans assume that public hearings and local ordinances prevent misuse. Yet, the system quietly works like this. Exemptions are often embedded in historical documents, or certain permits bypass standard approval processes. A small clause in city regulations can allow businesses or developers to operate in ways the general public would never expect. What happens next is rarely discussed. A single loophole can transform neighborhoods, influence housing markets, and shift economic opportunities silently. Inheritance and estate laws operate under similar principles. Federal and state regulations dictate how property transfers upon death, but subtle definitions can change financial obligations. For example, the classification of certain assets as gifts versus inheritances can determine tax treatment. Families with legal guidance can navigate these classifications to minimize liabilities legally. Most people never notice these details, assuming the law applies uniformly to everyone. Even civil procedures carry hidden nuances. Small procedural exceptions, such as filing deadlines or jurisdictional interpretations, can influence litigation outcomes. These details are rarely highlighted in mainstream education or media coverage, leaving the average citizen unaware of the precise mechanisms governing legal recourse. As we examine these structures, a pattern emerges. Loopholes are not defects, they are the natural byproducts of complex systems, shaped by historical precedent, legislative design, and interpretive practice. Financial legislation beyond taxation also harbors unnoticed loopholes. Regulations around retirement accounts, stock ownership, and investment vehicles are intended to protect consumers. Yet, hidden provisions allow strategic maneuvering. For example, certain retirement accounts permit deferred taxation in ways that effectively shift liabilities across decades. Corporations and high-net-worth individuals can leverage these rules to optimize asset growth while remaining compliant. Most people never notice this detail because the system relies on layered complexity. Federal oversight, state regulation, and internal auditing processes interact in ways that produce gray areas. What happens next is rarely discussed. These legal gaps create advantages for those who can afford specialized guidance, while ordinary citizens follow standard rules without similar flexibility. Another example exists in corporate law. The formation of shell companies, trusts, or specialized partnerships is not inherently illegal, yet it exploits the structural gaps between different layers of legal responsibility. Ownership, taxation, and liability can be separated in ways the average citizen would not anticipate. These mechanisms are hidden by design, embedded in technical language and procedural steps that discourage casual examination. Even mundane business practices reveal loopholes. Licensing requirements, reporting obligations, and compliance thresholds often contain exceptions for small entities or unique scenarios. While the intention is to reduce bureaucratic burden, these exceptions sometimes evolve into tools for strategic advantage. Most Americans never notice these details, assuming uniformity across all business operations. By examining these financial structures, it becomes clear that the law is less a rigid cage and more a lattice of options, interpretive spaces, and historical carryovers. The subtle gaps in these frameworks allow maneuvering, often invisible yet impactful. Employment law offers another realm of hidden complexity. Workers in the United States are protected by federal statutes such as the Fair Labor Standards Act, yet the application of these laws varies widely. Exemptions exist for certain types of employees, industries, and organizational structures. Most people never notice this detail, but these distinctions can significantly alter wage entitlements, overtime eligibility, and workplace protections. The system quietly works like this. Regulations are written broadly but interpreted narrowly. Court decisions refine these interpretations, leaving gray zones where legal guidance becomes essential. Employers with resources can navigate these nuances, while smaller organizations or individual employees might remain unaware of their rights or limitations. What happens next is rarely discussed. Gaps in understanding can lead to uneven outcomes in compensation, benefits, or dispute resolution. Beyond wage and hour laws, occupational licensing presents another layer of complexity. Each state maintains rules for professional qualifications, yet subtle loopholes allow exceptions for certain job classifications or apprenticeship pathways. These exceptions were initially intended to increase accessibility but can be exploited for competitive advantage. Most Americans never notice these details because the exceptions are hidden in legal and bureaucratic language. Workplace safety regulations carry similar intricacies. While federal guidelines establish baseline standards, states can implement alternative rules or exemptions. Historical precedents, grandfather clauses, and localized provisions mean that compliance is not uniform. The average citizen perceives a single standard, yet multiple overlapping frameworks create gaps. As we consider these structures, a theme becomes evident. The law is a living organism, balancing uniformity with flexibility. Loopholes are not accidental. They are byproducts of complexity, historical evolution, and layered interpretation. They quietly shape experiences, influence outcomes, and challenge assumptions about fairness and equality under the law. Consumer protection laws in the United States also reveal subtle loopholes. Federal regulations govern areas like product labeling, financial disclosures, and privacy, yet exceptions and exemptions are embedded throughout. For example, small-scale manufacturers or localized service providers might bypass certain federal mandates entirely, relying solely on state regulations. Most people never notice this detail, assuming a uniform national standard. The system quietly works like this. Exceptions are often based on size, geography, or historical classification. These distinctions create flexibility, allowing regulatory frameworks to adapt without frequent revisions. What happens next is rarely discussed. Corporations or organizations can leverage these spaces to operate efficiently while remaining legally compliant. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens assume universal protection, unaware of the nuances governing their rights. Another layer exists in digital regulation. Online services, data collection, and technology compliance fall under a complex network of federal and state statutes. Technical definitions, thresholds for reporting, and exceptions for emerging technologies mean that the rules applied in practice differ from public perception. Most people never notice these details because they are buried in specialized language and rarely explained outside professional circles. Even seemingly rigid consumer protections like warranty laws carry hidden gaps. Clauses about product usage, maintenance, or regional compliance can change legal obligations significantly. Businesses and consumers interpret these clauses differently, highlighting the uneven application of ostensibly uniform rules. By examining these structures, we see a consistent pattern. American law is built with both rules and spaces, authority and flexibility. Loopholes are not flaws. They are embedded mechanisms, arising from layered legislation, historical precedent, and the practical need for interpretive discretion. They quietly shape outcomes, influence behavior, and create a parallel dimension within the legal landscape, largely invisible yet profoundly consequential. Across taxation, property, finance, employment, and consumer regulation, a common theme emerges. The law is less a uniform grid and more a living web. Loopholes exist not because of negligence but because of complexity, history, and human interpretation. What most Americans perceive as fixed rules are often flexible structures with hidden corridors. Most people never notice these details because the system is intentionally intricate. Legal texts are lengthy, court interpretations vary, and procedural nuances multiply with each amendment or precedent. This opacity benefits those who can invest time, resources, and expertise into navigation, while ordinary citizens accept the surface-level understanding as complete. The consequences are profound yet subtle. Small gaps in taxation can preserve wealth. Unnoticed zoning exceptions can shape communities. Financial provisions can alter life trajectories. Workplace rules can produce uneven protections. Consumer regulations can vary depending on geography or scale. Across each system, hidden structures quietly influence outcomes, often without public awareness. Loopholes are not inherently good or bad. They are byproducts of a system balancing rigidity with flexibility. They exist as interpretive spaces within a framework that strives to be fair but cannot anticipate every scenario. They highlight the tension between legal certainty and practical adaptability, between the written word and lived reality. In the end, understanding these gaps offers insight into how American law operates in practice. The surface is only part of the story. Beneath lies a lattice of rules, exceptions, and interpretive spaces that quietly shape lives, often in ways the average citizen will never see. The next time you assume the law applies equally to all, consider the hidden corridors beneath its surface. Within these corridors lies the unseen architecture of power, influence, and opportunity. Quiet, precise, and profoundly consequential.